Yoga can help you. Yoga can help you. Man is both material and spiritual. Man is human and divine. We are quite familiar with the human aspect of our being, its consciousness, outward worldly consciousness. We know about that. Waking consciousness. We also are familiar somewhat with subconsciousness within us, wherein dreams are given to us and suggestions which keep us sometimes bound to this waking consciousness, sometimes lift us to higher excursions into the spiritual part of us. But that superconsciousness within us, that spiritual aspect of us, with that we are not so familiar. And it is time we should know more about that part of us. For instance, in this superconscious region within us, in this supernatural aspect of our being, things go on, such as the vegetative functions of the body, the heartbeat, circulation, respiration, assimilation of food, and all those things go on, unbeknown to us. That is the presence of God within us, although sometimes not dynamic to our consciousness. That's the superconsciousness within us. That's the spiritual part of us, and the supernatural part of us makes up the greatest part of us, except we do not know it so well. It is there. And yoga is that science which will give you the realization of the superconsciousness within you, the presence of God. That's why yoga is so important. Now, yoga can make this realm known to us. In the autobiography of Yogi, we read that a French professor, Professor Jules Bois, I hope my French is all right, at least that's his name, he had this to say about superconsciousness. He says superconsciousness makes man really man, not just a human being, not just a super animal. Realize that. We can become a super animal, know all about electronics and all that stuff, but unless we know the superconscious presence of God within us, we are still just a man elevated somewhat. But when we know that presence of God, know the superconsciousness through yoga, then we become a divine being. We express divinity. That's the difference between ordinary waking consciousness, subconsciousness, and the superconscious presence of God. Yoga will give us that realization. That's what we must understand. Now, although life is full of problems and many lives are wrecked, which we see going on about us, this need not be so if we know the superconscious presence of God within. Many lives are wrecked. Much trouble in the world. Two neighbors were talking out in the backyard, and one said, John and I were married by a justice of the peace. The other one says, really? By the racket that came from your apartment, we all thought you were married by the Secretary of War. So think of that the next time that you hear these things going on. That's that trouble that goes on in the world, but that need not be so. We can get up out of that into the superconscious presence of God. Then there's no need of the Justice of the Peace nor the Secretary of War. God alone is, and He's the one that lifts us out of this dilemma. And so understand this. Now, we are expressions of God, and as such, through yoga, we can make the contact and express Him. We can express divinity. The great Larry Marshall, who was a worldly man, I should say a man in the world, a family man I meant to say, in the world, lived in the world but expressed divinity. Through yoga. He's the one who gave us Kriya Yoga, of which I spoke in the beginning. Now he has this to say, and I think there is no testimony that will equal the words of Larry Marshall as regards the performance of yoga while living in this world, and most of us are in the world. This is what we read in the autobiography of a yogi. Radhamasha says, solve all your problems through meditation. Now that does not mean just contemplation of God, it means through God contact. Through meditation, get the contact with God, he says. exchange unprofitable religious speculations for actual God contact. We talk about religion. We come here and discuss sometimes. But if we sit in silence and through meditation, right meditation, feel the presence of God, we can solve all our problems. That's just what he says. Clear your mind of dogmatic theological debris. Let in the fresh, healing waters of direct perception. Aren't those words wonderful? We can discuss from now till doomsday about religion. You sit down in 2 or 3 minutes, if you can contact the presence of God, everything becomes clear. Through those clear waters of perception, direct perception, attune yourself to the active inner guidance. The divine voice has the answer to every dilemma of life. Though man's ingenuity for getting himself into trouble appears to be infinite and endless, the infinite succor is no less resourceful. No matter how deep you are in a mire of delusion, God can lift you out, because he has made even the cosmic dream wherein we find the delusion. So remember Larry DeMarce's words. Turn more through yoga to contact with God, and then solve your problems from that state of consciousness. If you try to do it from outward consciousness is unstable, and so your effort is unstable. It's not effective. But if you get to contact with God and feel his presence and work from that, nothing can stand before you. Such is his great power. Now, as to yoga. Yoga comes from the Sanskrit root, Aryan root, which means to yoke. Yoga means union. Like a yoke of oxen, they're bound together. That's where the English word yoke comes from the Sanskrit root. So yoga means that, union, and especially in our case, in our discussion this morning, union with God. Now, many experiments have been conducted in yoga to point out its scientific nature. The one that comes to my mind is that of Dr. Behanan of Yale, who went to India and through physiological and psychological experiments showed beyond doubt that yoga could tend to give us freedom from attachment to the body, coordinate all our functions so that we could act like children of God, not like human beings bound to this outward bodily vehicle. And he has these words to say, which are so wonderful. Yoga is the scientific system of procedure which, correlating the physiological and psychological human actions, leads to the union of the devotee's consciousness with the supernatural or with spirit. How often that does not take place. How often the physiological functions are going this way and the psychological functions are going this way. And the battle is on. But yoga will correlate those. Yoga will unite those functions so that you go one way, and that's to God. And this was done with scientific experimentation. He went to India, and with all his apparatus, he found these things to be true, as I have read, correlating the physiological and psychological human functions. Now, also, in the autobiography of a yogi, another reference pointing out the science of yoga is that of the famous psychologist, Dr. Jung. He testified of the undreamed of possibilities through the practice of the science of yoga. Now, there are 2 scientists who have experimented and found out that yoga can help you, can help me. Why? Because it is the science of union. Union with God. Not union with material consciousness, not union with subconsciousness, but union with the superconscious presence of God within. So, yoga, if followed, will give you that contact with the superconscious presence of God, but there's one thing we must be careful of, not to let it end there. It's wonderful to see the superconscious presence of God as his light at the Christ center. It's very exhilarating. Very comforting, but don't stop there. You will not be satisfied until you rise above that to a complete union with God and salvation. The great Larry Marsha has said that yoga must not stop with the being one with these different forces of God within us. There's the great light of His presence as the cosmic sound in it, or of His great love, but by complete surrender to God within us. That gives you salvation. Yoga is necessary to take you so that you can surrender. You cannot surrender to God if you're tied up with sensation and bodily ills and attached to the functions of the body. You cannot do it. Yoga takes you beyond that so you can surrender to God. That's why yoga is so important, why it is so necessary for each and every one of us. It gives us the ability to be able to receive the grace of God. Understand the difference. One yogi practiced in India 40 years, and he saw the light of spirit, and he was quite a yogi. But he finally had to completely surrender to God and receive God's love, which another saint attained in 3 days. Why? Because he fully surrendered to God. But yoga does take us to the point where we can receive the grace of God. That's the most wonderful point. That's why yoga is so important for each and every one of us. Now, there are certain kinds of yoga, just for a few minutes, to deviate just a little bit. There are different kinds of yoga. People get tied up with the different kinds of yoga. Hatha yoga. Hatha yoga, which deals with the perfection of the body so that we can receive and express divinity. Then there's jnana yoga, which is wisdom. Bhakti yoga, which is that yoga of devotion. And Kriya yoga. First, karma yoga, yoga of work. Most of us have to do that. Karma yoga. If you do it working for God and feeling you're pleasing Him, it'll take you to Him. Then there is the Kriya yoga, of which we spoke this morning, the fastest accelerator known to man to take you from attachment to the body to the freedom of spirit. Now, there's another yoga, which is Raja yoga. Raja yoga takes the best of all forms of yoga, and that's self-realization yoga. And in taking the best of the forms, it gives you this salvation which is so necessary. It gives you spiritual freedom. What good is freedom from the body, control of the mind, control of the devotion, unless you have freedom from attachment to those things? Then you have salvation. That's why Raja Yoga is so important. Self-realization fellowship yoga is Raja Yoga. And its greatest asset perhaps is Kriya Yoga, because it is that fastest accelerator which will take you from attachment to senses, mind, and intellect, release you from that attachment, allow your consciousness and life force within you to retire to the altar of God, the spine, and the thousand-rayed lotus of the brain. That's where God is. He isn't in sensation. He's right within your spine and thousand-rayed lotus as a conscious presence. That's the spiritual part of you. That's what you must know, and you can know it through yoga. Now, just one little point. Yoga, especially Kriya Yoga, controls the life force within us, the cosmic energy within us. Jesus said by the water and the blood. He meant by cosmic energy and consciousness. Now the great yogis found out that if you can control the life force, if you can put the life force, which is the energy of God within you, cosmic energy, if you can control that and direct it to the spinal region and the supreme center of the brain where God dwells, their consciousness follows along with it. That's an important thing. And so they found out these methods, gave us this system of yoga whereby the life force in the body is controlled. The life force is withdrawn from the senses, from the different internal organs which take up an awful lot of energy. It's released and it flows back naturally to the seat of God's presence within us, the spine with its centers and the thousand-rayed lotus of the brain. And what happens? Consciousness goes with it. That's what Jesus meant. The water and the blood, you can't do it with one. They both must go there. And they are from the one source. They're from the one eternal substance of God. His great consciousness moving becomes cosmic energy. But you can handle in an easier way cosmic energy than you can consciousness. And so the yogis have devised this, the great yogis, this system of yoga, whereby they control the life force, controlling that through especially Kriya yoga, releasing it from attachment to the senses and the body with the different functions. It flows to the spine through Kriya yoga, and the consciousness goes with it. And that's why you can perceive the presence of God, because God dwells in the spinal region, in the centers of the spine, and in the 1,000-rayed lotus. That's why yoga can help you, and that's why yoga can help me. And so understand that when you free your attention from the senses and mind and intellect, that's your soul. Your consciousness is the presence of God in you, your soul. And when you can do that, then can't you see your soul is free? Your soul is free from attachment to the body first, and then the mind. With a restless mind, the soul is tied tighter than anything. With restlessness in your mind, you cannot have any freedom at all. But when you release that through the practice of yoga, then your consciousness is free. Then it naturally expands to its natural state, freedom in the presence of God within. So that's why yoga is so important, especially Kriya yoga, because it first gives you freedom from attachment to the body, and then gives you God contact in the spinal region. Now, self-realization yoga will give you that contact. Self-realization yoga, many have practiced it in this room, will give you God contact, and with that, freedom and salvation. That's very important to realize that. Now, finally, yoga can help you, and by its practice can give you freedom and salvation. Now, many great saints attest to this. I want to give you one or two testimonies, and then we're through. First, the great Lord Krishna, who 5,000 years ago, I understand, was in India and was a great sage at that time. He has this to say about why you should practice yoga and why I should practice yoga. He says this in the Bhagavad Gita, the discourse, 46th line. The yogi, now those of you who have some doubts about yoga, listen to this. It's probably been presented to you as a strange practice or something only queer people do. Forget it. It's the most natural thing you should do. This is what it says. The yogi is greater than the ascetic, those who practice asceticism. I can agree with that. He is thought to be greater than even the wise. The simple devotee who practices yoga, which means union with God, he is considered to be greater than the wise. The yogi is greater than the men of action, those who build railroads and cities and all that business. The yogi is greater than they are. Therefore, Krishna says, become thou a yogi, O Arjuna. Isn't that wonderful? Yoga is really important to each and every one of us. Also, in the Bhagavad Gita, the discourse 8, 10th line, this is most wonderful, speaking about what yoga will do for you. With unshaken mind, he whose mind is stayed in me, I will give him perfect peace. With unshaken mind, fixed in devotion, feeling the love of God in your heart, really wanting God, really wanting his great love. In that state of consciousness, by the power of yoga, drawing together the life breath in the center of his two eyebrows at this point, yoga gives you that realization. He goeth to the Spirit supreme divine. Jesus said, if thine eye be single, thy body will be filled with light. Follow the light of that cosmic energy to the realm where God dwells, and you'll have freedom. That's what Jesus meant. If thine eye be single, thy body will be filled with light, spoken of in Matthew. You will be taken to the Spirit supreme divine. Isn't yoga important for each and every one of us? I think it is. From the testimony of Lord Krishna, the great saint of India, ages ago. Now, Babaji said the same thing. Babaji is one of our great gurus who gave Kriya Yoga to Lardy Marsha, and he in turn gave it to Sri Tessaji and down through our master Paramahansa Yogananda. Babaji has this to say. You'll find it in the Gita, the second discourse, the 40th line. He says, a little of this religion, a little of this yoga will save one from dire suffering. Why? Because it gives you union with God. It gives you contact with God. In God is the only place we find freedom from suffering, from discomfiture, restlessness. In Him we find it, perfect peace. Those who meditate and have found it, they won't give it up, they can't. There's nothing but God. God is reality. And so Babaji says that. And finally, Lardy Marsha. Lardy Marsha, by his great example, showed what yoga can do for you and for me. He was a family man, as I said, and lived in the world, but in spite of that, he found God to such an extent that what he has given to us is Kriya Yoga, and his different realizations of the presence of God within us in the spinal centers is beyond comprehension. Yet he was a family man, like most of us, living in the world. He did that. He found God in the silence of his own chamber. He communed with God. That's what every true follower of self-realization wants to do and will do. They'll find God, not outside necessarily in the churches. The churches are, of course, in order, but right within themselves, in their own hermitage within, they will find the presence of God. Lardy Marsha did that. This is what he has to say. We read in the autobiography, or what is said about him. Unknown to society in general. Think of it. A great spiritual renaissance started in 1861 in a remote corner of Benares. As the fragrance of flowers cannot be suppressed, so Lardy Marsha, quietly living as an ideal householder, could not hide his innate glory. When the presence of God comes into the devotee, then the glory of God shines through him. That's what we must do. We must not try to do it through ego, but by allowing the presence of God to come in and through us, then it shines forth. And so it says, as the fragrance of the flowers cannot be suppressed, so Lardy Marsha, quietly living as an ideal householder, could not hide his innate glory. Devotees from every part of India began to seek the divine nectar of the liberated Master. And so can we. We can, if God's power comes into us, if through yoga we prepare the instrument to receive his great spiritual vibration, then he can utilize us as he wishes. Now this yoga was known to Elijah, to Patanjali, to Kabir, to St. John, and St. Paul and others. They practiced this. For St. Paul says, I protest by the rejoicing, I die daily. What does that mean? He dies to worldly consciousness. He dies to subconsciousness. But he rises to superconscious presence of God within. That's what it means. St. Paul says clearly, I die daily. He died to this outward consciousness, but he was in the presence of God as the superconscious presence within him. That's what it means. Yoga can help you and can help all of us. And finally, the reason why all of us should practice yoga is for salvation. We all want salvation. We all need it. We've got to have it. That's the law of God. All things must return to Him. And so that's the reason. Salvation, that we should practice yoga. And yoga can be practiced in any climate, any place, by anyone. A yogi is he, a man of renunciation who practices yoga and thereby renounces the fruit of actions of this world and meditates upon God. That's all. He doesn't have to be single. He can be married. He can be at any station in life. He must renounce outward consciousness for the better consciousness of the presence of God within. And above all, why we should practice yoga? It gives salvation because it gives each and every one of us the universal realization which is present in each one of us. As Jesus said, if thine eye be single, thy body will be filled with light. Everybody can see that. Hindu American, of any country, any creed, any climate, when they sit down and practice yoga correctly, elevate their consciousness from attachment to this body, everyone sees the spiritual eye at this point. The light of God, the presence of Christ consciousness. Isn't that the universality of religion? Isn't that necessary? Seeing that, merging in that, realizing they are not the body, then they attain freedom and salvation. Yoga can help each one of us if we but do it. And finally, one reference from the autobiography, this God contact is what we need. That's what will give us salvation, nothing else. You can have all the money in the world, all the houses, everything, but until you feel the love of God in your heart, through God contact you have nothing. That's why yoga is so necessary. It gives God contact. And the last reference from the autobiography, yet the ordinary man is not therefore shut out from the possibility of divine communion. Isn't yoga necessary? Can't it help you? The ordinary man is not shut out from the possibility of divine communion. He needs, for divine recollection, no more. He needs to remember God, that's what it means. He needs for divine recollection no more than Kriya Yoga technique. A daily observation of moral precepts and an ability to cry sincerely, Lord, I yearn to know Thee. Master said God loves us more than we can imagine, more than we can think of. He loves us more. He wants us more than we do. If God wants us that much, surely each one of us should practice yoga. Practicing yoga, we will be lifted so that His grace can descend upon us, lift us into oneness with Him, to live with Him eternally.